Well, it's nice to see some familiar faces. I don't know. We're going to have talking in class, I guess, eh? So just to refresh your memory, for those that have a little hard time with names, I'm Geoff deJong. I'm pastor of St. Martin's in Fairfield Baptist Church. And I've been married to my wife, Debbie, for 23 years. And it's a pretty awesome thing to be the only son-in-law of a guy like John and Weiler, so I get to be the favorite. And John, you folks were all just in his seminar, and so if anything I say reflects badly on him, I apologize now, but he's been my mentor for my whole 23 years and then some. He's an amazing, amazing human being, and I hope you learned a lot from him. I hope I can share a little bit of what the Lord's taught me in my context in St. Martin's and Fairfield. It's been an interesting journey, as I alluded to earlier, and I'm going to spend a little time talking about why it is that they asked me to come and talk about this stuff, and at the same time give you hopefully some tools for a process to work towards unity in and among and between your churches. Because it's a concept that's near and dear to my heart, and I never dreamed when the Lord gave us the opportunity to work together with Fairfield that someday He'd want me to talk about it, and here I am. So it seems to be becoming more and more common. I have two children. My daughter Brianna she turned 22 this past week, which makes me feel old, and she's been married for 2 years, which makes me feel older. And then my son Ben, who just started at Crandall in September, and he's living with his grandparents, living the dream because they spoil him rotten, and he has his own basement basically to himself, and it works out really good. It's great knowing where they are. But as I also alluded to, it's really, really hard to deal with such a big change in your life. It rocked my world, if I can put it that way. And I thought it was going to hurt, and then I realized how badly it in fact did hurt. And I didn't know who I was without my son and my daughter in the house. And some of you probably feel that way about your churches some days. That things change, or maybe they're talking about change, and you start thinking, well, I used to know what it meant to be in this church, or it used to be my church, now I don't even recognize it. And so hopefully as we talk about this process of churches working together, of unity in the body of Christ between churches, and perhaps unity in your own church, hopefully we can gain some comfort with allowing everybody to be part of the discussion and part of the process and seeing healing and genuine change happen for God's sake and for the kingdom. So the story of St. Martin's and Fairfield began, as I said, with a request from Greg Jones. He came to me and we sat down for lunch at Swiss Chalet, and he said, "Geoff, would you consider working with Fairfield?" And if I'm really honest, my first thought was, no way in this world do I want to work with Fairfield or any other church. That's the really honest truth. And maybe you feel that way about working with another church. For me as a pastor, it just means more work. It just does. When I was in school at the time at Atlantic Baptist University, now Crandall, I had the Glades in Forest Glen, and my wife complained I was always busy, I was never home, and honestly as a pastor I felt like I wasn't able to be very effective, because when you're doing 2 or more churches, you just feel like you're running all the time instead of really accomplishing kingdom stuff, right? And the stuff you're doing is important, but it doesn't necessarily feel like you're doing what Scripture says the pastor's job is, equipping people for the work of ministry. You just spend a lot of time, like the little Dutch boy putting your finger in the dike, right? My family's Dutch, so. So when Greg asked that, the first thing I had to do was go back and talk to my wife, because every good man knows that if you don't have your wife's support, it's probably doomed to failure anyway. And not only was I having reservations, but my wife's first instant response was no, because she knows the cost we would have to pay, the price it would cost us to just be a church that's a field where the pastor shares the responsibilities and it's just run, go, 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 go. And especially with our kids just having left home, she was kind of hoping she might see me a little bit. Right? But we prayed about it, and we decided, well, God's doing something, or else I don't think the request would have happened. We need to at least explore what this means. And so I went and talked to my deacons at St. Martin's, and I said, Fairfield's just asked if we would consider helping them. They weren't even saying work together at that point. They were looking for help. Because Fairfield was in crisis. They had had 2 pastors in a row back to back that they'd had to let go. Okay? With all the costs that go with it. They had to give each one severance pay because they fired them on the spot, and complicated mess and legal stuff and all the rest of it. And it created a situation where Fairfield, to say the least, didn't really trust authority. But at the same time had a lot of hurting people in there. And the church was hemorrhaging money and people between paying the payouts for firing these two pastors and the fact that people were just saying, I don't want to deal with this mess. A lot of folks were just staying home. The average Sunday, a good Sunday at that point, and we're talking 2010, they were on a good Sunday seeing 12 to 15 people. And on the roll they have 50 or so that live in the community. Okay? So they come to us and say, we need help, because they're afraid that they're going to close. There's a catalyst to cause this request to happen. I go to my deacons in St. Martin's and got a surprising response, frankly. Part of me kind of hoped, well, I'll tell them and they'll say no and we'll just move on. But I'm just being honest, folks. Because it would have been easier for me if they'd said that. They didn't say that. They said, well, we have to do something. We didn't know what that would be, whether we should give financially, whether we should share, whether we should help them out for a little while. We had no idea what that would look like, but we knew we had, they felt we had to do something. So they said, go talk to them. And they sent me down to this unknown congregation, this unknown context to find out, well, what's really going on. And Fairfield, although they were desperate, they hadn't lost sight of the most important thing that every church needs to keep their eyes on, which is their job is to build the kingdom, not to keep the doors open. And so with 12 or whatever people there, they said, well, we need help because we really feel like God still wants us to reach where we are. Because as I said earlier, rural settings, there's communities every 5 kilometers sometimes, and they're all different. And they valued that. They said it's not we just want to close and go somewhere else. We think there's a need for us here, and we want to do something for the kingdom, but we can't do it by ourselves. And so as we started that conversation, we started to see that there's some commonality, some common interests, and we worked through it together. What we had to start with, though, was very, very, very uncomfortable. So, folks, if you don't like being uncomfortable, you probably shouldn't try this. But we had to start with the history. We had to start with looking back. And in St. Martin's and Fairfield, St. Martin's is a 200-year-old church. Okay, we just had our 200th anniversary last weekend. Fairfield was founded in 1875, so two churches with a lot of history. As far as we can tell, unfortunately both churches have had fires and don't have all the records, but as far as we can tell, they've been working together for at least 80 years, and then it fractured in about 1985. The two churches split very unhappily over a pastoral issue. Okay? There were broken relationships, there were broken families as a result. Brothers and sisters that didn't speak to each other for almost 20 years. Okay? I'm not dramatizing that. That's what we had to deal with. Okay? So when we sat down together as two deacons boards, we had to talk about, well, before we can even talk about working together in some way, we have to deal with what happened. And that was part of our process, and it will be part of your process if you decide to work with anybody else. You're going to have to at least explore who you were before you can talk about who you are and who you want to be. Okay? Now, I'm not going to go all Freudian. I'm not suggesting you need to bring out all the dirty laundry on the couch, but we do need to deal with that stuff, okay? So for us, that was quite a painful process because St. Martin's thought that Fairfield had attacked the pastor they loved, and Fairfield felt like St. Martin's abandoned them. Because what actually happened was they had a pastor, as far as I know, a very good pastor, but one family, and some of you folks will know what I mean, one family hated that pastor down in Fairfield. And they made it so miserable for that poor pastor that, and I'm a pastor so I sympathize with him, that's just the truth. Maybe you'd sympathize with the family. But they made it so miserable for him that he went to the board at St. Martin's and he says, I'm going to resign, I can't stay here anymore. Now, what should St. Martin's have done? They should have gone and talked to Fairfield. They didn't. They simply said to this pastor, we love you. We want you to stay. Why don't you stay here full time? They'll have to fend for themselves. See, because there was no relationship between those churches. All they did was share as pastor. And that's not unity, is it? Unity isn't uniformity. We don't have to look the same. We don't have to be the same. But unity is a commitment to be together and to do stuff together. And they didn't do that. They just shared a pastor. So when we sat down and talked about the wounds, we had some of our seniors, as I say, saying, I'm absolutely never working with those people again. They're horrible people. And we had to have a conversation about, well, wait a minute. Fairfield feels abandoned. St. Martin's feels like they attacked the pastor, but both of them were wounded. And our leadership, we're fortunate. We have something weird in St. Martin's. We have lifetime deacons. We don't have terms. Okay? Most Baptist churches have terms for the deacons and everybody else. So we actually had at least one deacon on our board still that was there when it happened. And God used that man in a powerful way. His humility to be able to say, we blew it. We should have gone and talked to the leadership of Fairfield and tried to figure it out. Right? And we had an incredible reconciliation happen. And Scripture tells us God has given us a ministry of reconciliation. Right? Unity can't happen without reconciliation, folks. It's got to start there. Before you can run any process, before you can do any program or project, there has to be a willingness to reconcile with one another. Not just with God. We tend to think vertically all the time and forget about the horizontal with one another. Right? And so it was so critical for our journey for us to recognize that. And then once we had reflected on the past, we could respond to it and process it and begin to talk about, well, what can be? Because we didn't have any idea. We weren't starting out thinking, well, we should become a field again. That was not the solution we were looking at. We had everything on the table from, well, we could just give them some money to maybe we could just help them out for 6 months to, there was all kinds of ideas on the table. We had no idea where it was going to go, but we recognized we needed to develop a process, and we had a timeline in that Fairfield was struggling in crisis, and they needed answers quicker, sooner than later. They weren't looking for, okay, we could talk about this for the next 2 years and come up with a solution. When you're down to 12 people, you need to move. Right? And so we began to talk about how to move forward. And so in the challenges we had to deal with the history, what happened before. We had to deal with our own internal momentum. Okay? St. Martin's thought they were fine. We were getting the bills paid, we were doing okay, stable, right? Have you ever seen a bell curve? You know what I mean by the bell curve? Right? Statistically. Church growth works on a bell curve. And this is the problem for most of our churches in Atlantic Canada today, based on the number of baptisms we're seeing, is that even the ones that think they're okay, we're right up here at the top, and we're just about to start heading downhill. Because we tend to be older congregations, we're not reaching the next generation, the seniors are dying off, we're starting to have financial trouble because a lot of those seniors are great givers, and it creates a problem, doesn't it? But St. Martin's hadn't quite tipped over the edge, they were still doing okay. But any church that's doing okay should be saying, wait a minute, we're in trouble. Because okay is not what God intended. God called us to be kingdom builders, people that are reaching lost souls for Jesus Christ, that are sharing the good news, that are ministering to the poor, doing all these things that God loves. And so the challenge was for us to recognize that. And St. Martin's, to be honest, at the start of the process, did not recognize they had a problem. All they saw was somebody else with a problem that they thought, hey, we'd like to help. Which is a good thing to do. But they hadn't really recognized that they too had a problem. And they didn't recognize, as so many of us don't, that sometimes the best way to deal with your own stuff is to help somebody else. Right? If you're depressed, there's no better. I go down to Outflow. Every month our church goes to Outflow in St. John, and we serve about 160 to 180 hungry people a meal. And I tell you what, I never go home depressed when you're serving God, when you're doing kingdom work. Right? It's just the way it works. Right? Anyway, so we had to deal with the question not just of momentum, but of motive. Why are we doing this? And in my experience, both in working with St. Martin's and Fairfield, and also there's a couple of guys here that were part of 5 churches that started a discussion back in January about doing some stuff together. Almost always, in my experience thus far, and I would probably argue probably always, there's going to be a crisis or some kind of problem that's going to occur that's going to cause people to finally ask the question, what could we do differently? Right? In the case of the 5 churches, it was the Glades Baptist Church, where I pastored those 2 churches, was now in crisis and now has closed. But we figured out a process where they could not only deal with the question of whether they should close or how they could work together, and at the same time how those churches, Rodney and Paul are part of, could maybe help that congregation not get lost in the shuffle if they did close. I was just talking about that earlier. Where have you got any of the folks from the Glades over there? And that's so important. How do we do that? How do we actually care for those people? Right? And how do we begin to deal with the hard questions? Well, we need a process to do that. But recognize there's almost always going to be a catalytic kind of thing, an event, a crisis or a problem where people finally will say, I don't want to, but I got to do something different. And that's true in our lives too, isn't it? Yeah. My kids left home and I looked at my wife and I said, who are you again? Right? Because I love her, but suddenly she's not mom every day. And she was for 22 years. You know? And I was dad every day. And so you kind of get into your role, don't we? And our churches, that you get into your roles, your patterns, right? And so the question becomes, how do we move from just having a motive to make some changes? And for our context, our people very quickly grabbed onto one important thing, was that it was an opportunity for witness. You know, it was really, really exciting, folks. I have to tell you this. To have the kind of board, and maybe you do, maybe you don't, but maybe you've never had a chance to find out. My board in St. Martin's said, imagine what the people in the community would think if these two churches that have been feuding for 20 years start working together again. Right? I mean, they got excited about it. We didn't know what it was going to look like, whether we'd end up sharing a pastor again or whatever. We just said, what if we could have healing there? What a testimony to God's grace if we could do that together somehow. And I tell you, we often miss this, right? Scripture says they'll know we are Christians by our love. That's the people out there. And instead, what people knew in St. Martin's and Fairfield was, those are the ones that hate each other. Right? You know, can you imagine the average non-believer being called by God's Spirit to come to him, and he thinks to himself, I know I'm going to go to the church that hates that other church. It's probably not going to happen, is it? Right? Our ability to witness, to be effective for the kingdom, was hindered by that rift between us. And one thing I'll say about at least pursuing unity, folks, is it gives us the opportunity to be a witness again. To show the community that there is something different about us. And Jesus himself, when he's teaching us about serving, he washed his disciples' feet. And he says, I didn't come to serve, but to be served, but to serve, right? And so much of what we do is self-serving. Let's be really honest. In our own lives, in the lives of our churches, it's about feeding who's already there. It's about doing what we've always done because we like it. I grew up in church. I love hymns and the organ. But I've never yet seen a 30-year-old's car drive by with organ music playing. You know? And as I was sharing with the other group, we just got a set of electronic drums in our church about 7 or 8 months ago. We had a new family come to our church, and the fellow has been playing drums since he was 13. He's a 48-year-old police officer. But he thought he'd like to play the drums, so we said, well, we'll try it for a month. We'll rent them and see if people like it or not, because it's a traditional sort of church in St. Martin's. And my son was at worship practice. And we sang a few choruses at the start of the service, right? That's what you usually do. You save the good stuff for later, right? And so we did our practice, and when the practice was done on the choruses, we said, we're going to practice the hymns now. And my son, 18 years old, starts to leave. And the fellow started playing the drum with the hymn. And my son turned around and came back. Such a simple thing. But when we think about unity, we think about what's good for others, not ourselves. Right? I mean, just think about the average marriage. The happiest marriages are the one where people aren't saying, I'm not happy. They're saying, when they say, my job is to make my spouse happy. Right? Because if I make my wife happy, I'm happy. Right? If I'm worried about my happiness, my wife's probably not happy. Right? See, this is where we're supposed to be different from the world, because we're called to serve, not to be served. Right? So we saw blessing and the opportunity to be a blessing. We've seen an incredible thing happen with fellowship. One of the things that developed out of our coming together of the two churches in Fairfield and St. Martin's was we very intentionally said, we're not going to be a field again. Right? The classic busy pastor field. We said, if we're going to do this, we're going to share everything we can. And I mean everything. So every month with 5 Sundays, we cancel our regular services and have a joint service. We take turns where it's hosted so everybody gets the chance to see what, to be in the other place. When we do that, it's not one person hosts, it's we do it together. So our worship teams join. Our choirs join. When we do youth ministry, we only do one. And we do it together. When we do children's programs, we do it together. Our children's program in St. Martin's is currently run by 2 ladies from Fairfield. Okay? So 2 ladies, in any other context, we normally say, well, what are those people from that other church doing at your church running the program? We're celebrating that because that's what it means to be, as we're calling it, one church in 2 locations. Because that's how the process led us. Now, that may not be what your church does. The great part about the process I'm going to show you is it helps you discover the unique solution for your unique situation. I don't want to give you a cookie cutter, this is what you should do. I want to give you a tool that will help you discover what God would have you do for His kingdom where you are. Does that make sense? Okay? And we've found that this process worked well for us. I think Paul and Rodney probably agree it's worked well for them to begin to move forward for the kingdom in their churches. And you know, how well it works depends on how much you put into it, as most things do. But we decided we would share everything. People, facilities, programs, the pastor, and our resources. And it just makes sense. Folks, it's what Scripture instructs us to do. So our process, and I'm going to get into the process you should use, but our process started with the end. The first thing we did is we said Fairfield is in trouble, they need help. They don't need help 2 years from now, they need help now. And at the same time we recognize that we can't just ram something through and say we're going to do X or Y because, well, first of all, we're Baptists, we don't do things that way. And second of all, because in both churches there was a lack of trust in leadership. Okay? The previous pastor in my church in St. Martin's fell, morally and ethically. And the leadership had been left with no choice but to fire him, and were not free to tell the congregation what happened. And so many people felt betrayed because that pastor they loved was suddenly gone. Fairfield, as I said, had to let 2 pastors in a row go and had been without a pastor for a period of time and had learned just to do things on their own. And so they just felt like we don't need authority. Okay? And so to have a healthy process, we determined that we must include people in every step of it. That there wasn't any room for in-camera and confidential. And if we understand what it means to be Baptist, there shouldn't be anyway. I mean, there's legally things nowadays we have to keep confidential, but in general, we should trust that God's Spirit can speak to anybody at any time. And that He can give wisdom to who He chooses to give wisdom. And so we wanted to hear from them as well, because the leaders sitting around the table don't have a monopoly on what's right or wrong or best for the church. So we committed ourselves. We were starting the conversation in February. We said by September, we're going to make a decision on what we're going to do. Without folks being honest. We had no idea what that would be, but we said by September, we're going to do something. Okay? Which is kind of liberating, actually. Because it's not, we're going to do X, and now we've got to figure out how to convince the people to do it by then. It's no, by this time, we're going to do something to help this other church. And we had the conversation. I prayed about it. The deacons prayed about it. We told the congregation at St. Martin's, is it okay with you if we talk to Fairfield about possibly doing something together? So we didn't hide even that the conversation was happening. Okay? And it was great. I could go visit little old ladies and they could ask me questions and I was allowed to answer them. You don't understand how hard that is sometimes, because sometimes pastors feel like, oh, I can't say this. Oh, I better not say that. And, right? We were given complete freedom to be open about the whole process. And as healthy processes go, I think this was one of the things that made it so possible for reconciliation and healing to happen. Nobody felt like anybody was trying to hide anything or pull wool over any eyes or whatever. We committed to the process of discovery and action. This is often hard to do, but we said, okay, if this is where we want to stop and make a decision, we worked back and set dates in a timeline over the months. This is when we're going to have a proposal ready by. This is when we're going to present it. This is when people are going to have a chance to respond to it and give us their input and feedback. This is when we're going to meet to incorporate their feedback. And we didn't just listen to people and say, that's nice, pat them on the head and go on. We incorporated their ideas into the document, came back again and presented again. And we set dates for all when those things would happen. And that gave us a timeline to work for. And folks, I'll tell you, to be honest, unity is hard work. Our deacons, especially our leadership team, met weekly for months. Okay? The level of commitment it takes to bring about unity, right? It's high. It's not going to happen just by, slowly, gently meandering down the path. And the other thing that we realized, I think, is the importance of momentum. If you take too much time, people get tired of the process and bored with it. And they're just like, it may be worth it, but I'm burnt out. I'm tired. Right? I can do anything for a little while, but if I have to do it for too long, I get just worn out. Right? So we worked through that process together. We agreed on the steps we would take. And we consulted constantly. Scripture says there's wisdom in many counselors, folks. We consulted with other pastors, with other areas. I called a number of pastors I'd known that had actually brought churches together. Unfortunately, there's not that many, but there was a list I had of folks that I knew. And at the same time, we consulted with our leadership and with our congregation every step of the process. Keep the discussion process open and pray. Pray throughout. It's just essential. One of the things you need to recognize is you're not at this point doing vision stuff. Okay? Leadership circles, I don't know if you folks read much of that stuff, but a lot of times leadership circles talk about mission and vision. Mission and vision. But what you're dealing with here is culture. Okay? There's a book I would recommend highly called Cracking Your Church's Culture Code by Samuel Chand, C-H-A-N-D. Cracking Your Church's Culture Code. Culture beats vision every time. Okay? If you have the best, you may have the most God-honoring, godly vision for something He wants you to do in the world, but the culture of your church will stop it cold if the vision doesn't fit the culture. It will. Okay? I was saying to the early group, in the same way that if I showed up at your house at Christmas and informed you we were doing Christmas my way this year, right? You don't know me or my way, you'd probably be upset even for the suggestion, wouldn't you? If I said, by the way, the tree's going over there and we're not having turkey, we're having ham and we're forgetting the stuffing because it's bad for you. Right? You'd be like, there's the door, buddy. Right? And the mistake we make in dealing with processes and change and looking for unity is we often think that we can do it without changing the DNA. Without addressing the fact that we all have different ways, things we love, things that we're passionate about, things that maybe we've done for 20 or 50 years. And when somebody talks about changing them, it threatens us. And so we have to accept that. So Cracking Your Church's Culture Code, Samuel Chand, I really do recommend it as a way to understand your own church and how it is, how it got where it is. Tools in the toolbox. Lots of tools in the toolbox. Folks, if you're not praying about this, it's not going to happen. I put it in there repeatedly to try and drive home the point. Pray, brainstorm. Do you folks know what a SWOT analysis is? It's a very helpful tool in the toolbox. It's a short form SWOT for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And as a brainstorming tool, it focuses people beautifully. Because all you do is you sit down and you say, okay, folks, let's write down what are the strengths of our church. What are the strengths of our church? And what we did is we sat people down around tables with 6 or 8 people with a big sheet of flip chart paper and had them write in marker so they could share it afterwards. And we could all see, these are what people believe to be our strengths. And then we did the same with weaknesses. Somebody's phone's vibrating. Okay. Strengths. Threats. Threats. Things that threaten us. Okay. And we tend to, this is one that's easy to miss, but we tend to focus on internal threats, but there's a lot of things externally that threaten our churches today. For example, our Atlantic Canadian economy is threatening our churches, right? The lack of jobs is meaning many of our young people and families are moving away. Many of those that even stay are being fragmented because maybe the husband or wife's going away. Children are on their own a lot more than they used to be. It's just having a huge impact. People are giving less because they're worried about their jobs. There's just so many ways that we are threatened by the economy right now. Right? And that's been true before in history. It'll be true again. But to recognize it is then to recognize that if there's a threat from outside that you can't control, you must look for ways to cope with it. Okay? It's frankly, from a stewardship perspective, is one of the best arguments for unity, for finding another church to cooperate with. Because anything we can do to share costs just makes sense in an economy where we're limited on what we can do for the kingdom. Right? God's not limited, but we end up finding ourselves feeling limited. Why? Because we're duplicating so many things. 2 churches, 2 pastors, assume they're both full-time, 40 hours a week. Well, we're told that the average pastor spends 8 to 10 hours a week in sermon preparation. Well, if one person preached twice, suddenly the other guy's got 8 or 10 hours free to do something else for the kingdom. Just for example, right? And when you start thinking in those terms, you suddenly open up the possibility of multiplying what you're doing instead of duplicating it. Why do we run multiple youth programs, each with 6 kids, where we're going, I don't even know what to do with 6 kids. Put those 2 groups together, you got 12 kids, suddenly they're having a good time. Right? This stuff just makes sense. Right? When we talk about unity, how do we come together? But the SWOT analysis is very helpful because you go through one thing at a time and have the group share, but it gives the opportunity for each group to think through. Unfortunately, most people, you sit them down and you say, what are your strengths? They go, and you go, what are your weaknesses? And then they go, right? Because most of us know our weaknesses. Opportunities are what are the things we could do, either to use what you already have, more effectively, or to do something. Maybe there's something new you think what we should be doing is, and it gives people a chance to dream a little bit. And then the threats is okay. Well, we got to deal with threats, don't we? If somebody's got a gun pointed at you, you have to deal with it, right? One way or the other. You have to have discussion and reflection. We had meetings with leaders. We had meetings with extra people that were key leadership roles. We had meetings with congregation. You can't leave anybody out of the process. Okay? You absolutely must include the entire congregation in the process. Otherwise, frankly, it's doomed to failure. Okay? Respect the democracy that we are as Baptists. Doesn't mean you respect their right to vote. It means you respect their right to be heard. Okay? Voting is important, but too many churches, the leaders say, this is what we think, and the people go, yes or no, and they move on, and there's not really a conversation where they have a chance to say, well, that's a good idea, but what about this? And then to have that idea integrated. And we did that very purposefully, that when we brought back the second draft of our proposal document of what to do, the congregation could see that we had heard them and we'd incorporated their suggestions, their additions, and their changes in the document. It was no longer the leaders, it was ours. Okay? And it's important that it gets on paper. If you're just talking about it, it's not real. Right? It needs to be something that can be articulated. This is what we want to do. This is where we want to go. This is what we're thinking. The other thing that's so critical is that you do a trial. Anybody know how Thomas Edison invented the light bulb? He failed thousands of times. Okay? Literally thousands, maybe tens of thousands, according to his biography. And you know what he called those failures? Opportunities to discover what didn't work. Okay? He never ever thought he was a failure. He never ever gave up. He just said, well, okay, found out that was not the right way. Let's try something else. And by doing change as a trial, you give the congregation permission to be skeptical, to test, and then to decide whether or not they want to continue, or to say, actually this isn't working, and to go back, as the case may be. In our case, we did it as a one-year trial. We rationalized that it's not fair to try and put two churches together, have them work together, to be sharing every ministry possible, unless we do it for a full calendar year, because we need to see every season of the church to know if this is possible. I needed to see it as the pastor. Can I sustain this for a year? Christmas season, Easter season, summer season, when our congregation in St. Martin's completely switches to a different group of people. Doesn't it, Ted? Right? Ted comes down and spends the summer with us. And it's awesome how it works, because in my congregation in St. Martin's, we're a tourist town. And better than 50% of our people disappear for the summer, from May till October. And yet I have more people during the summer than in the winter. Okay? That tells you how radically it shifts. We're normally sitting 60 to 70 people. Summer it's usually 70 to 80. And 60% of them are not faces I know. Some of them are familiar ones like Ted, others, they're new. But it's always changing. Right? And I needed to know, can I minister to this summer and winter congregation plus this other congregation and still keep my sanity and be there for my wife and have a healthy marriage and be there for my kids and all that, right? But our congregation needed to know, could we do that together too? We needed to build relationship. And so we have every month with 5 Sundays we have shared services. We do that together. And have shared meals, because that's what Baptists do. And I'll tell you what, when the church split up 20 years ago, when the two separated, they had no relationship except that they shared a pastor. They never did anything together. No shared ministry, no shared programs, no shared events. They did everything separately, just a busy pastor. And I told them, I ain't doing that. We're going to share everything we can. And the cool part is, families reconciled, churches reconciled, community sees it, and we got people serving from each church in the other context. And God has done that. But what this process I'm talking about today allowed us to do is discover how the process works. Now, folks, I put prayer on there 4 times, but I want to say this. Who knows who Tony Campolo? You've heard that name? Okay. There's a story of Tony Campolo that they were doing a project and they needed to raise some money. And the amount they needed to raise was quite substantial, and so they got together his leadership team, and the leaders on that team all said, we've got to pray about this, and pray hard, and pray long, and pray often, and we just got to bury this in prayer. And Tony apparently said, how about before we pray, we all put what we have to give on the table? And when they did, they had enough, and he said, let's go home, we don't need to pray. Right? Sometimes what we need is more obedience and less prayer. Because we're praying so hard for God to do it our way, we're not willing to obey and just do it His way. He's told us to give, right? It's funny that so many churches are praying, oh Lord, please provide for our needs. And the means to do that's already there, right? We need to be obedient. So, here's what I'm suggesting as a process for you folks to discover what you can do in your location. Okay? And this won't always look the same, but this is a basic process. The first thing you do is you set a date for change. The very first thing you do. You admit, hey, we need to change something. This is the date we're going to change it on. We don't even know what we're going to change yet. But we're going to change something on that date. Okay? And the change is to build God's kingdom. How that happens, whether that's starting a new relationship with another church, whether that's doing a revival meeting, or who knows. You could use this process for almost anything, but in the area of unity, it's going to be normally about building a new relationship. I've often thought, wouldn't it be great if some of our bigger churches would adopt one of our smaller churches and we could share resources, share everything from musical instruments to curriculum to who knows what. Imagine what we could do if we didn't all have to keep buying the same stuff. What would happen if we shared pastors more often and didn't have to worry about paying for 2 salaries or 3 salaries or whatever between 2 or 3 churches? I mean, what would happen if we had more money free for kingdom stuff, for feeding the poor, for caring for widows and orphans, for proclaiming the gospel? What would happen if we could do those things? Set a date for change. What's going to change? Then go back and you say, okay, if that's the date we want to make some changes, when are we going to meet to make sure that happens? When are we going to have our proposals ready? When are we going to get together to discuss and brainstorm, to do that SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats? Okay? See, by building a timeline, you guarantee that at the very least a conversation towards unity starts. By building a timeline, you force the issue of when are we going to deal with the fact we need to reconcile with one another. Because if you're going to start working together in September, for example, we started in February, we were aiming for September to start working together in some way. We didn't have time to waste going, gee, I wonder if I'm ever going to be ready to share how I was hurt. We had to get together and talk about it. Right? I mean, it's hard work. It's not easy stuff, but it's worthwhile. You have to set dates for proposals. We set down dates for a first and second draft for our congregations. We presented the first draft. I think we gave it to them the end of May. We met the next week. After they had a week to pray about it and think about it, we sat down and said, okay, tell us what you think. And they had all kinds of great ideas that ended up being added to the thing. They had some changes they wanted made. We made those. So when we came back again with the second proposal at the end of August, they could see that we had listened to them. And at that point, they felt like it was now their dream too, and they were learning you could trust their leaders because we listened to them. Right? And many of our churches need that. Many of our churches have people that don't really trust their leadership. And the leaders need to trust the people, and the people need to trust the leaders. That's the only way it works. As if it's a two-way street, right? And so when we gave it back to them in September, we gave them another chance to feedback, and then finally brought them actually a third copy. We gave them a week before the vote, which was scheduled for the end of September, with a start date of October 1st. And when we did that, we saw some really cool things happen. In St. Martin's, when we gave the first proposal out, I had people tell me before they ever read it, I'm voting no, I hate this idea, I don't want to share. The end. And over the course of that summer, while I was honestly depressed and despairing and thinking, God, why'd you take us through this horrible process if it's going to fail anyway? Because we said we need at least 80% support to even try it. For 1 year we agreed. And I knew at least 15 or 20% of my people were saying no, flat out. They weren't waiting for the vote. They were telling me up ahead of time, I'm voting no. And so we went into July thinking, I thought at least, it's not going to happen. Because I didn't have enough faith. In July and August, I had at least 8 people come to me and say, God has convinced us that we need to at least give it a chance. We still don't like the idea, but we need to at least try it. And the vote in end of September was 92% in favor. And the really cool part is after trying it for a year, it was 96%. Because what happened is when people saw God's kingdom being the focus, they could get behind that. And the younger people engaged in it because we were doing something that mattered. We weren't just talking about buying a new garbage can or fixing the plumbing. Okay? It's really, really important to see the way God has moved through this process for us, and I believe can for you. But you have to invite people into the process. Okay? If it's the pastor's vision or the leader's vision, it's going to fail. It just is. It's got to be the church as a whole. Leaders, pastor, whole congregation have to be included. Give people the opportunity to have input. As I say, by having it an open process, nothing confidential, meant anybody at any time was free to approach me or one of the deacons or anybody else involved and say, hey, what about? And to have honest answers. We didn't have to hold back. That was kind of a nice place to be. I think Rodney and Paul, your experience would be that was good too, having the conversations openly.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
A little different challenge.
Absolutely. And that was the point.
Everything's unique, right?
It ended up being a completely different discussion, but we followed the same process. Right? And that's what I'm offering is not a cookie cutter, here's what your answer to your problems is. It's a way to discover God's answer to your situation where you are. And it probably shouldn't look like my answer. Okay? If it does, too often churches are saying, oh, we'll just do a silver bullet. We'll grab 40 Days of Purpose or Alpha or some program and think, well, that'll fix our problems, instead of saying, no, we need to together search for the mind of God and have a process that will help us to discover that together and that holds us accountable to work our way through it with a finish time, because nobody wants to be in a process like this forever. Right? And by putting it on paper, it becomes real and tangible and actionable. You can do something with, this is what we decided to do, now I'm going to go do it. As long as you're just talking about it, it's just warming the room up, right? Just hot air. And so we need to, again, give permission to try and permission to fail. That's the other thing. The trial is such a gift to your people. It's the leader's way of saying, we trust you, and it's the people's way of saying to the leaders, we trust you. We're willing to let you try this. And the leaders are saying, we're willing to let you say it's not working. Right? It no longer becomes about whether or not I got it right or I'm perfect. It just becomes about we're looking for what God has for us. And that's the goal, is to find a result, a unique solution which fits your context and needs. Okay? That's the most important thing we can do, because all of our churches need help, don't they? Is there any church here that thinks we're just fine, we don't need any help? And as I said in my my introductory message, what would happen if? What would it look like if, in terms of reaching people, if we could be better stewards of what God's given us? He's given us enough already. We have enough people with gifts. We have enough people. We have enough money. We have enough buildings and facilities. I mean, as much as I love seeing great big new churches like this built, this isn't at the end of the day what builds the kingdom. It's God's people united, loving one another and loving the lost, right? This is just a tool, like a shovel in the shed. It's a very nice tool. Don't get me wrong. But it's not about this. When I watched my people, what's really amazing about them is St. Martin started off thinking they were there to help. And Fairfield started off looking like the ones that needed help. But the really amazing part over the last 3 years, that both the discussion process and then 2 years of working together, is that both sides actually finally realized they need each other. It's no longer St. Martin's going, oh, we're helping out Fairfield because they were in trouble. St. Martin's has realized, man, we would have been in trouble without them. Fairfield, every Sunday since the day we started, has met their budget. Just let that sink in for a second. How many of your churches meet their budget every week? Okay? Their average attendance now is 20 to 30, where it was at 12. They've seen some new folks come. They've seen a couple folks get saved. St. Martin's has had some folks come, some folks get saved. God's kingdom is moving forward. We have 2 of Fairfield's ladies that come and run our kids program. Or do our cantata, both choirs join together. Everything we can, we share. We have small groups in both places. They go back and forth. There's people from both churches. We're calling ourselves one church in 2 locations. That's our solution using this process. Okay? Yes?
Do you preach in each church?
I do. Yeah. I do. Yeah. Same sermon. What's that?
The time.
St. Martin's and Fairfield, when they were together the first time, met at 10 and 11 o'clock, which meant the pastor would finish at 1 and run and come in partway through the second one. And one of the things that I really appreciated about both my churches in this process is they gave me both veto rights and authority to make fairly bold changes, in that when we had our trial, before the churches voted whether or not to continue, I got to vote on whether I was willing to keep doing it. But 10 and 11 didn't work for me, because I don't think I can pastor my people unless I know them. I don't think I can pastor my people unless I worship with them. And so I said we need to change the service times. So St. Martin's now meets, this long version of the answer you're looking for, St. Martin's now meets at 9:30 and Fairfield 11:30, which gives me an hour between the services. So when service is over, I still get to talk to people at the door. Especially some of our men, that's the only time I see them because they're working all week.
That was the problem with
Yeah.
when we were in 2 church deal
Yeah.
with that matter.
Yeah.
We just started preaching for an hour and
And it doesn't work. It doesn't work. And at the same time, at Fairfield, I get there early enough, I get to greet them when they come in. And both churches, it worked out well, because part of the process is discovering each comes as an equal partner and each compromises. It's not just one making all the moves. So St. Martin's moved from 10 till 9:30, Fairfield moved from 11 to 11:30, each moved by half an hour, right? And every part of your process, if you're actually considering people's feelings and your culture, you look for that. So it's not they're sacrificing and we're not, right? Fairfield came to the table saying we need help, but they also, when we actually finally got down to sitting, talking about possible solutions, said if we're going to share, we want to pull our weight. And so they very deliberately figured out what they could afford and said right up front, this is what we can contribute for the first year, and we want to commit ourselves after the first year. If the trial succeeds, we will pay 1/3 of the pastoral costs. Because looking at congregational sizes, they were about 1/3, versus 2/3 in St. Martin's.
Another question, Geoff.
Yes.
How far are you apart, the 2 churches? You say you travel.
It's 12.5 kilometers.
See, my question is why not combine it and meet in one place and have one budget and one deacon's board and one pastor and one minister?
There's a short answer and a long answer. Okay. The short answer is there's a lot of good reasons to do that. And one of the things that I've realized stops the process cold most often is we quickly jump to that's the best solution, because just intellectually, it doesn't make sense what we're doing, folks. We inherited horse and buggy churches. If you could get there in a horse and buggy, you planted a church, and then you planted another church, and honestly, it doesn't make sense. Mm-hmm. But when you understand and appreciate the value of how different 12.5 kilometers of community can be, I'm learning to appreciate that in some cases at least it makes sense to keep those individual churches, because they do minister to a different demographic, a different people group that would never darken the door of the other place. Because they are truly different in their culture. And that's why I mentioned the culture thing, because the culture is so radically different. Fairfield's a very free spirit, kind of open, very congregational driven. Everybody has their gifts and they use them whatever way they see fit. They have very few boards and committees. St. Martin's is far more traditional structured, and the community is more that way too. And if you tried to ram those two together, you'd probably have a lot of conflict. What John was talking about, how to deal with. It's not to say it's not worth doing. And in some cases, if I'm really honest, I believe that it's probably likely that at some point, if these two churches continue to work together more and more closely, that somebody organically inside is going to eventually say, why don't we do that? But I think we need to allow for there to be steps in the process, and jumping from 2 to 1 is a huge step, if it's to happen at all. And it needs to be the Lord's will, not just, I think it's a good idea. And that's the tension. And in your context, it may very well be this process leads you to, we should just build one central location or join together at one location. I don't know your context. But that's where this, again, process should help you discern that. And some of it's going to depend on how brave your leaders are. and how willing your congregation is to listen and to share and to have input into that. Because I think the more that we can do for the kingdom stuff, I think intellectually the stewardship, if we really were honest, we're wasting a lot of money on old buildings.
Well, we have a unique situation right here. I'm connected with Hillsborough here.
Yes.
We've got 5 or 6 churches around here, and some are closing.
Yeah.
And so what you're saying is the whole discussion could certainly apply.
Exactly.
And I'm not too sure whether the word culture, whether there's a cultural difference between.
Yeah. And again, there may not be for you. There was with Fairfield and St. Martin's. But it would make sense if they're closing, especially like one of the things Paul and Rodney are trying to do is invite the Glades. Hey, your church is closing, come and be part of here. And if we know each other, that's going to be a more natural thing to do. But right, if you don't know each other, you're going to tend to go, man, I'm just going to go somewhere else, right? And that's where again it's fellowship and relationship. And if we don't have that. When we get together for our shared services, it's really awesome when you see Fairfield and St. Martin's people sitting around the same table, just sharing a meal, breaking bread together, right? Because at that point, they're loving one another, and if there's a problem, maybe they get mad at one of them gets mad at me, they're not just going to say, get lost, because that's going to cost them their friendships, and they're going to say, we got to work on this first before we just make a big decision, right? And what does it look like for Hillsborough to love on these other churches that are closing or struggling? And to start a discussion. What would it look like for Hillsborough to be the catalytic one that says, you know what, it's not a crisis this time, it's a care. We care about you, how could we help? And maybe that help is an invitation to come together. I don't know what Hillsborough's solution is, but, this process can help you work through to find a solution. And that's what I'm encouraging you to think through. Because too many of our country churches are dying, and they don't need to. But they do need to transition to what is kingdom building again, just like our associations, right? Association formed so we could do bigger things together, stronger together, right? And we forget that too easily when we're doing meetings and talking about policy and procedure and structure. That's not very exciting stuff, is it? And so, that's the challenge for us. Other questions?
I had a question, Geoff. I like what you said. Everybody must be heard. So you've had a lot of meetings through this process. And I've also heard people say, well, if you set up a committee, if you take away their authority, and that's not good either. Like, you made us a committee, so we're going to deal with that. And they don't always want everybody to be in on it, but I think what you said makes sense.
Yeah.
It used to be more that way because people were more trusting and it's different. People need to know what's going on.
People need to know.
Yes.
But what we're talking about is not doing a job that's already being done. In this case, we called on our leadership team, which happens in our church context to be the deacons of each church, and said, okay, let's sit down and start talking and see if we can come up with something, and let's invite the congregation to have some input and work through the process. Some leadership teams, some churches have boards of management where there's reps from different committees. Very few churches, though, have a vision team. Very few churches have a team whose job is to keep focused on the mission of kingdom building. So you're usually not stepping on too many toes that way. But you do need to make sure you invite the right people to the table to start off with, for sure. In some churches, there's a mover and shaker that if they're not at the table, it won't happen. So you better put them at the table right to start off with. And that you can do that with this process. Because you're not trying to keep anything from anybody. You're not trying to convince the naysayers not to be part of it. You're saying, no, we need you at the table. Right?
There's been so many Christian leaders that have betrayed people that everybody needs a wide open book now.
That's right.
And if they don't have that, then you're not going to get them on board because they don't know what's going on behind the scenes. And they're scared. Yeah, they're scared.
And rightly so.
Yes.
One of the things that I respect with Rodney and Paul, and it's my personal goal, is these guys are long-termers. They're not here for 2 or 3 years. And for churches to learn to trust pastors, we need pastors that are committed to the churches too. It's, again, a two-way street. You would be hard-pressed to find a church in Atlantic Canada that has a pastor who's been there for 10 years or more that isn't what I would call relatively healthy. Most of them are growing. Growing. Right? And which should be an encouragement to you. Invest in your pastors, folks. Invest in your pastors. Pray for them. Guard them. Make sure that they have the resources they need to do their job and to care for their families. Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions? Comments?
Very helpful. Very good. Thank you.
Takes a lot of emotional energy, like I say, all your meetings and.
Yeah.
How long was this whole process?
The first conversation with Greg Jones was in November of 2010, and it was September 29th, 2011, we voted on trying it. Okay? So, I mean, with the Glades, they called me in January, I think, originally, and we started meeting as 5 churches, March? First part of March. 5 pastors and I sat down, 4 pastors and I guess, sat down and we started the conversation about, well, what would it look like there? And I offered them this process, and it's so far at least been helpful to them, and they're working out what they had a vote. What was your vote you were saying?
It averaged out, because 5 different churches voted.
Yeah.
It averaged out at like 92-point-something%, wasn't it, Rodney?
Yeah.
Yeah, and all churches were around the 90.
Yeah, there was one that was a tick under 90, like 89.8 or something, and the rest were all over 90.
Yeah. And again, when you recognize it's about culture, people buy in when they're part of the process, right? Because nobody when they became a believer thought themselves, I want to just do boring same old, right? Just like when any of you had a child, when you first had your child, what do? You want to tell everybody, right? When you're first saved, you're just so excited about what God has done, you want everybody to know. And yet somewhere along the way we got buried in the mundane, the boring, the maintenance. And maintenance has to happen, but it's not our primary task. Right?
Just want to make a comment that 2 or 3 years ago, the Hillsborough Church here sent out a mailing to the surrounding areas to book in our church, verify all churches.
Yeah.
They were having an estate planning seminar.
Oh, okay.
They had a financial planner, a lawyer, and
Sure.
criminal referees.
Right.
And the comments in our church was, how dare they advertise in our
Yeah. Yeah.
But Julie and I did attend that seminar. We were interested.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
there was what,
Yeah.
10 people?
Yeah.
Not well attended.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
just over a year ago, the Hillsborough Church attempted a fun day for their children after their vacation Bible school, and they contacted the churches around.
Right.
Would you be a part of this? And we'll set up in Hillsborough, and you can bring, set up and advertise what you have available in your church. So after work, I was on my way down there, got off work or whatever, and I was going through my mind, how's this going to go? How are they going to use that? I was pretty negative about it myself, but that it was something we should try. And when I went down through Hillsborough, up the hill there, and there wasn't a place to park. Lined up on both sides. So I don't know if it's just the way it was approached.
Yeah. Yeah.
But we should embrace what the others are.
Yeah. And that's.
They took the lead in it. And,
I came to Atlantic Canada December 2001. Started as a youth pastor January 2002. And then went to the Glades a year and a half after that. And the first person to show me around was another pastor in the area. And this is how recently the transition has happened. He actually took me for a drive and showed me where my boundaries were. Okay? I won't tell you who it was. No, I'm not kidding. He's like, this bridge is the edge of your parish. He says, that's mine over there.
oh boy.
Right?
And personally, we didn't see where they were infringing on anything. They were going through a lot of work to bring some people in.
Yeah.
They
were, but there has been traditionally a real horrible, whether we articulate it or not, a competition between our churches that we felt like people were sheep stealing or whatever, right? Very territorial, folks. That is so not of God. I mean, could you imagine? Jesus putting up with that kind of nonsense. How many times did he sit? His disciples arguing about who's going to be first, right?
It doesn't have to be that way.
What?
When you came to the lake, you were showing your limits, right? Your territory. And when we sat down together, we really appreciate their leadership, Geoff, too.
Yeah.
5 churches sat down together. One of the things we did at the interim, even before the vote, and actually culminated with the night of the vote, because we had the 4 churches that were still able to be operational for facility logistics and so on. We had 4 combined services planned, June, July, August, and September. And every one of those services was just completely packed the place out.
Yeah.
And if it did absolutely nothing else, it brought churches together and encouraged them. Wow, this is what our church looks like when it's really full, right? But then also that last combined service
wasn't even Christmas.
Well, then it wasn't Christmas.
Yeah.
But in a way, maybe it was. In some ways. But we came together in that last vote. I think there was that celebration event where we're actually doing something together.
Exactly.
And all of a sudden, those boundaries, those edges of territories were taken down. We're just coming together.
Yeah. To go back to your analogy, if Hillsborough made a mistake the first time, is they didn't talk to the others first. And so often we either take the attitude of, well, they won't want to do it, and we assume we know what people want, or we take the other side and say, well, we're not letting them get in our way, And there's a bit of an adversarial thought that goes in some leadership circles that just the fact that you guys were invited to the fun day changed the nature of it. You're invited not just to come, but to be part of it, right? And whether you actually did anything at it or just showed up, you at least felt like you were allowed to contribute, right? And I don't know of a soul in any of my churches that loves Jesus. Let's be honest, there's some wheat and some tares, right? But the ones that love Jesus, there's not one of them that wants to sit and just warm the pew. They all would love to give something of what God's given them back. But unless they're invited to, most of them are not going to. And it usually has to be very personal. It has to be, hey, would you, right? Because when we just say it from the pulpit, it goes over their heads. They don't hear it. Right? And for unity to happen, for true unity to happen, that's why I keep saying you got to include people in the process. You got to say, hey, if Hillsborough's the one saying, hey guys, we see you guys struggling. Can we help? And start a conversation. Who knows where it might lead? It might lead to churches becoming one and saying, we got this amazing new facility, let's just all meet together. Or it might look like a cooperative effort like what Fairfield and St. Martin's are doing. Neither one's right or wrong. It's just let's figure out what's best for the kingdom. Right? And let's respect the others enough to say, hey, just because we think it's a good idea doesn't mean they have to do it our way. Right? Because that's the other thing us Christians are guilty of, aren't we? If people don't act Christianly the way we act Christianly, we often think, well, they're not really Christian. Right? And we're very busy judging sometimes instead of going, you know what? There's some kids out there with hubcaps in their ears that I think they're nuts, but that doesn't mean they're not believers. And you all know what I'm talking about, right? Like to me, I as a Christian could not do that, but does that mean that they're not allowed to? That makes them less Christian?
Exactly.
Right? Just because some little church says, no, we think it's important, we're still here, but there's 12 of us left, but we're going to keep going, doesn't mean they're wrong. But will we respect and honor them and come alongside and help them if possible? And that might open the door someday for them to say, okay, we're ready to make a change. A real big change. But if we're not willing to do the little stuff, the big stuff's probably not going to happen. Last time I checked, God still works through flawed, imperfect human beings like you and me. Right? All I know is this process works. Folks, it facilitates finding out together what God would have you to try. And that's all we're about. We're not about finding the ultimate solution. No silver bullets. No, this is the right answer for everybody. Just, this works. Right? And I think it's fair, and I know that both our churches now respect the leaders again. Right? Fairfield tells me all the time, we just had Pastor Appreciation Month in October, and I got a card signed by every member in that church. Just saying thank you. I tell you, that means so much. That they, this is a church that had to fire 2 pastors, and suddenly you're going, thank you. Right? And that's not bragging on me, that's bragging on them and what God has done. It's amazing. Because unity is kingdom stuff. Dealing with conflict, what John was talking about, is kingdom stuff. Right? We're given a ministry of reconciliation. We need to do that together.